Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. I want to start with something that happened in a kitchen. Not the wedding, not Madison Square Garden, not the 1,000 people and the flowers and the light. A kitchen. It was the night before the wedding, July 2nd, 2026. There was a dinner. Small, family, and close friends. The kind of gathering that happens the night before a wedding, when everyone who matters is in one city for the first time, and somebody says we should all eat together, and suddenly there are 40 people in a room. I had gone into the kitchen to get water. That is the whole reason. I wanted water, and I did not want to bother anybody, so I went and got it myself. Which is what I do, which is what I have always done, because I am from Ohio, and we get our own water. There were two women near the doorway on the other side. They did not see me. The kitchen was large, and I was around a corner, and they were talking the way people talk when they believe they are alone, which is to say honestly. They were talking about Travis. One of them said, "Is he really going to sing tomorrow?" The other one said, "Apparently." The first one said something I could not hear. And then the second one, and I am going to be careful here, because these are women I like. Women who love Taylor deeply. Women who have been in her life through things I will never fully know about. The second one said something like, "I just hope somebody has told him what he's walking into. Half of Nashville is going to be in that room." And the first one said, "Does he know that?" And the second one said, "I don't know if he knows what that means." They moved off. I stood in that kitchen holding a glass of water I had not filled yet. I want to be clear about something. Those women were not being cruel. They were not gossiping in the ugly sense. They were doing something that I recognized immediately, because I have done it myself, about people I love. They were worrying out loud. They were protecting Taylor by worrying about the person she had chosen. That is what friends do. That is what good friends do. But I stood in that kitchen with an empty glass in my hand, and I felt something rise up in me that I had not felt in a long time. Because they did not know. They did not know what I knew. They did not know about a 5-year-old boy in a living room in Euclid, Ohio in 1994. They did not know about a 15-year-old who stopped singing and the reason why. They did not know about a phone call I got in June, 3 weeks before that wedding, at 11 o'clock at night, from a 36-year-old man whose voice was shaking. They did not know any of it. Nobody did. Except Taylor. And that is the whole story. That is what I want to tell you today. Let me take you back to 1994. Euclid, Ohio. The house on the street where we raised those two boys. A living room with a couch that had seen better decades, and a television that was not big, and a stereo system that Ed had put together from components he had acquired over the years, none of which matched, all of which worked. Travis was 5 years old. I need you to understand what Travis Kelce was like at 5 years old. He was enormous. Not fat, solid, long. Already the biggest kid in every room, already the child that other parents looked at twice when they walked into a birthday party. And he was loud. My God, was he loud. He had one volume, and it was on. He talked constantly, about everything, to anybody, with the complete confidence of a small child who has never once been told that his opinions are not universally fascinating. And he sang. Constantly. All the time. In the car, in the bathtub, in the grocery store, at the dinner table until we told him to stop, and then again 3 minutes later, because he had forgotten we told him to stop. He did not sing quietly. Travis has never done anything quietly. He sang the radio, he sang commercials. He sang songs he had heard once, and half remembered, and filled in the rest of, with whatever words seemed close enough. He sang things he made up on the spot about what was happening in the room. He had a song about the dog. He had a song about the mailman. He had a song about Jason that Jason did not appreciate, and which I will not repeat. And here is the thing that people do not know. He was good. I do not mean he was cute. Every mother thinks her 5-year-old is cute when they sing, and every mother is right, and it does not mean anything. I mean, he could actually carry a tune. He could hear a melody once and reproduce it. He could find harmony without being taught what harmony was. When something was in the wrong key, he would stop and start over in the right one, at 5 years old, without anybody telling him. Ed noticed it before I did. Ed was sitting in that living room one night. I want to say it was fall. I remember the light being early. And Travis was on the floor doing something with blocks and singing along to whatever was on the stereo. And Ed put down what he was reading and looked at him. He said to me quietly, "He's got it." I said, "Got what?" He said, "An ear. He's got an ear." And I said, "He's 5." And Ed said, "I know. He's got an ear anyway." We did not do anything about it. I want to be honest about that. We did not get him lessons. We did not put him in a program. We were two working parents in Euclid, Ohio, raising two boys who were already showing signs of being very good at football. And football is a thing you can see a path in. Football has a structure. There are teams and levels, and a way it works. Singing did not have a path we could see from where we were standing. So we let it be a thing he did around the house. And he did it around the house for years. Through elementary school, through middle school. And then he stopped. Here is what happened. Travis was in his freshman year at Cleveland Heights High School. He was 15. He was already 6 feet tall and heading upward fast, already on the football team, already becoming the version of himself that the world would eventually recognize. There was a choir. He joined it. I do not remember whether he told us he was joining it or whether we found out later, which tells you something about how much attention we were paying to that particular corner of his life. He was in it for a few months. And then one day he came home and he was quiet. Now, Travis being quiet was an event. It was not a normal condition. If Travis came home quiet, something had happened, and the something was usually significant, because the ordinary difficulties of a teenage boy's day did not slow him down at all. I asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. I asked again at dinner. He said nothing. And then later that night, much later, when Ed was asleep and Jason was in his room, and it was just the two of us in the kitchen, because Travis had come down for food, which he did at all hours, because he was a growing 15-year-old, and the refrigerator was a full-time relationship, he told me. Somebody had laughed at him. That is it. That is the whole thing. Somebody at that choir practice had laughed at Travis Kelce singing. I do not know who. He never told me. He may not have remembered clearly by the time he was 30. I do not think it was even necessarily mean-spirited. It may have been the kind of laugh that happens when a very large 15-year-old football player opens his mouth and something surprisingly delicate comes out, and a room full of teenagers cannot handle the incongruity. But it landed. He told me about it standing at the counter eating cereal at 11 o'clock at night, and he told it lightly, the way boys tell things that hurt them, with a shrug in his voice, as if the point of telling it was that it did not matter. He said, "I'm not doing choir anymore." I said, "Because somebody laughed?" He said, "It's not a big deal. I don't have time anyway. Football's starting." And I let it go. I have thought about that decision many, many times since. Whether I should have pushed. Whether I should have said no. You are going back. We do not quit because somebody laughed. That is what I would have said about football. That is what Ed absolutely would have said about football. But it was not football. It was singing, and singing did not have the same weight in our house, in that year, in that town, in that family that was already organizing itself around the athletic thing that both boys were clearly very good at. So I let it go. And Travis Kelce stopped singing. Not entirely. Not in the car, not in the locker room, not in the goofy public way he would eventually become known for, the Travis being a character way, the version where the singing is a bit and everyone is in on it. But he stopped singing the way he had sung in that living room at 5 years old. He stopped singing like he meant it. For 21 years. There is a piece of this I did not know until much later. I found it out in 2019, 21 years after it happened. I was at a grocery store in Cleveland. I want to say it was a Kroger, it does not matter. And a woman stopped me near the produce. She was maybe my age, a little older. She said, "Are you Donna Kelce?" I said I was. This happens sometimes, and it is usually lovely. She said, "I taught your son." I said, "Which one?" She said, "Travis. Choir. 9th grade." Very briefly. And something went cold in my stomach. I said, "He didn't stay long." She said, "No, he didn't." And then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "I have thought about that boy for 20 years." I put down what I was holding. She said, "He had the best natural instrument I ever had come through that room in 31 years of teaching, and I want you to know that I know exactly what happened, and I have never forgiven myself for it." She said, "Some kids laughed. It wasn't even mean, they were 14. They laughed because a huge football player opened his mouth and this beautiful thing came out and they didn't know what to do with it." She said, "And I did nothing." She said, "I should have stopped the room. I should have said, 'No. Listen to that. Do you understand what you just heard?' And I didn't. Because I was young, and I didn't want to make it worse by making it a thing, and I thought if I just moved past it, he'd move past it too." She said, "He never came back." She was crying in the produce section of a grocery store in Cleveland, Ohio, in 2019, about something that had happened in 1998. I said, "It's all right." She said, "It isn't." And I said, and I meant it. I meant every word. I said, "He's had a good life." She said, "I'm sure he has. He's had a wonderful life. But there's a version of him that never got to happen, and I was in the room when it stopped happening, and I said nothing. I did not tell Travis about that conversation. I want to be honest about that. I carried it for 7 years and I never told him. I thought about it constantly, and I never told him, because I could not figure out what telling him would accomplish. Here, son, is a piece of information that confirms a thing was taken from you, and that an adult who could have stopped it did not. What is he supposed to do with that at 30 years old? So I kept it. I told him in July 2026, 4 days after the wedding, on the phone. I said, "I need to tell you something that happened in 2019. And I told him. He was very quiet the whole way through. When I finished, he did not say anything for maybe 15 seconds. Then he said, "What was her name?" I told him. He said, "I remember her." He said, "She was nice." Then he said, "Mom, I want you to hear something, and I'm not saying this to make you feel better." He said, "I don't think it was taken from me. I think it was postponed." He said, "Because if I'd kept singing at 15, I'd have been a guy who sings, and I'd have been fine, and I'd have had a nice life." He said, "But I wouldn't have played football, and if I hadn't played football, I would never have been at Arrowhead in July of 2023, and I would never have made that stupid bracelet, and I would never have gone on the podcast and complained about not meeting her." He said, "And she wouldn't be my wife." He said, "So I don't want that teacher to feel bad. I want you to find her, and tell her I'm not mad. Tell her it worked out." He said, "Tell her it worked out. Better than anybody could have planned it." I did find her. It took me some time. I wrote her a letter. She wrote back. I am not going to tell you what she said, because it is hers. But I will tell you that she came to something, later. That is all I am going to say about it. She came to something, and Travis found her and shook her hand, and I watched the two of them talk for about 4 minutes. And then he hugged her. And she stood in that room and cried, the same way she cried in the produce section in 2019, except differently. Now let me jump forward. June 2026. 3 weeks before the wedding. I was at home in Cleveland. It was a Tuesday. It was 11 o'clock at night, which is late for me, Because 73-year-old bodies have opinions about 11 o'clock. My phone rang. Travis. I picked up, and I said, "It's late. Are you okay?" And he said, and I could hear it immediately. I could hear it in the first 3 words. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react." I sat down on the edge of my bed. I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm going to sing at the wedding." I did not say anything for a second. He said, "Mom?" I said, "I'm here. I'm processing." He said, "Yeah." And then there was a long pause. And in that pause I could hear him breathing, and I knew, the way mothers know, the way you know from a specific quality of breath on a telephone, that he was not calling me to share good news. He was calling me because he was scared. He said, "Taylor asked me, a month ago. She said she wanted me to sing at the wedding, and I said no, and she said okay, and she didn't bring it up again for 2 weeks, and then she brought it up again once, very carefully, and I said no again." He said, "And then last night I told her yes." I said, "Why did you change your mind?" He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Because she told me something." I said, "What did she tell you?" And Travis Kelce, 36 years old, 3 weeks from his wedding day, said something to me on the telephone that I have thought about every single day since. He said, "She told me she'd heard me." I said, "Heard you what?" He said, "Sing." Actually sing. Not the joking around thing. Not the locker room thing. She said there was a night. She wouldn't tell me which one. She just said there was a night, when I was in another room, and I didn't know she was awake, and I was singing something to myself. He stopped. He said, and she said she'd been listening to voices her whole life. She said it's literally her job. She said she's been in rooms with the best singers alive, and she knows the difference between a person who can hold a note and a person who has something in their voice. He stopped again. He said, and she told me I have something in my voice. I sat on the edge of my bed in Cleveland, Ohio, at 11 o'clock at night in June 2026, and I closed my eyes. Because Ed had said the same thing, in a living room in Euclid in 1994. He's got an ear. 32 years apart, 2 people who love him, the same observation. And in between those 2 moments, a teenager at choir practice, and somebody laughing, and 21 years of a man not singing like he meant it. I said, "Travis." He said, "I know." I said, "Do you want to do this?" And he said the truest thing he could have said. He said, "I want to want to. I'm not there yet, but I want to want to." I said, "That's enough. That's how everything starts." He said, "Mom, half of Nashville is going to be in that room." I said, "I know." He said, "What if I—" And he did not finish the sentence, and he did not have to. What if somebody laughs? 21 years later. A grown man, one of the most accomplished athletes of his generation, a man who has caught passes in Super Bowls in front of 100 million people, a man who has hosted Saturday Night Live and acted in television shows and stood in front of cameras his entire adult life without flinching. What if somebody laughs? That is what 15 is. That is what 15 does. It gets in and it stays in, and it does not care how big you get, or how much you accomplish, or how many rooms you learn to walk into without fear. There is a room somewhere in every person where they are still 15 and somebody just laughed. I said, "Nobody is going to laugh." He said, "You don't know that." I said, "I know that if they do, it will not matter, because you will not be singing to them." He said, "Who am I singing to?" I said, "To her, only to her. Everyone else is furniture." Long silence. He said, "Okay." He said, "Okay, Mom. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Taylor. It happened about a week after that phone call. Late June. She and I were on the phone about something wedding-related, some logistical thing that I do not remember at all, and when the logistics were finished, neither of us hung up. That happens with us. It happens more and more. We finish the practical thing, and then we just stay on the line and talk, and I have come to look forward to it more than I expected to. I said, he told me, about the singing. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, he did? I said, he called me. 2 weeks ago, 11 at night. She said, was he? How did he sound? I said, scared. She let out a breath. She said, yeah, he's been carrying it around. I said, Taylor, can I ask you something? She said, of course. I said, why did you ask him? And I want to be careful how I frame what she said next, because I have thought about it a great deal, and I want to get it right. She did not say, because he has a good voice. She did not say, because it would be a nice moment. She did not say any of the things you would expect someone to say. She said, because I think he's been carrying something around for a long time, and I don't think he knows what it is. I said, what do you mean? She said, I have watched him sing, not perform, sing, when he doesn't know anybody's paying attention, and there's a thing that happens to his face. It's the same thing that happens to my face. I know that thing. That's not a person who likes music. That's a person who needs it and has been telling himself for 20 years that he doesn't. I sat with that. She said, Donna, I have spent my entire life around people who make music, and there is a specific kind of person, I've met them, I've worked with them, I've been one of them, who has something in them that has to come out, and if it doesn't come out, it turns into something else. It turns into restlessness, or intensity, or that thing where they can't sit still. She said, I think that's part of what football has been for him. I think some of what he pours into that field is the thing that didn't have anywhere else to go. I said nothing for a moment because I did not trust myself to speak. Because she was describing my son. She was describing the boy in the living room who sang about the mailman. She was describing the 15-year-old who stopped, and the 36-year-old who still would not sing like he meant it. She was describing something I had watched for 3 decades without ever having the words for it. She had known him for 3 years. She had the words for it. I said, how did you know? She said, very simply, because I'm the same. Because when I was a kid, music was the thing that had to come out, or I would have gone crazy. And when I see it in someone else, I recognize it immediately. It's like, she paused, looking for it. It's like a dialect. You hear someone from your hometown, and you just know. Then she said the thing I have carried since. She said, everybody's going to tell him he can't. That's going to happen. The minute he does anything with this, people are going to say he's an athlete playing dress-up, that he's using his name, that he doesn't understand what he's stepping into. She said, they might even be partly right about the difficulty. Nashville is hard. It should be hard. It's earned that. She said, but they're wrong about him. And I said, why? And Taylor Swift said, because Travis Kelce is the hardest working person I have ever met in my life, and I have met a lot of hard-working people, and I include myself in that. He does not know how to do anything halfway. Whatever this becomes, he will earn it. He will outwork every single person who doubts him. He always has. That's the whole story of his career, and everybody watched it happen, and somehow they still don't understand it about him. Long pause. Then she said quieter, and also, Donna, he has a beautiful voice. That part's just true. I'm not being romantic about it. I've heard it. I sat in my house in Cleveland, with the phone against my ear, and I could not say anything at all for several seconds. Finally I said, thank you. She said, for what? I said, for hearing him. And she said something that undid me completely. She said, he's easy to hear. Everybody's just been looking at him instead. 2 nights before the wedding, July 1st, there was a rehearsal. Not the ceremony rehearsal. That was a different thing, a formal walkthrough with the planners and the timing and the where do I stand and when. This was something else. This was a smaller thing that Taylor had arranged, quietly, at a studio somewhere in Manhattan that I could not find again if you gave me a map and a week. She had arranged for Travis to practice. She had booked a room with a piano and a sound system and one engineer she trusted completely, and she had told Travis, "Come sing it once, just once, in a room with nobody in it." He asked me to come. I want you to sit with that for a second. A 36-year-old man, 2 days from his wedding, asked his mother to come sit in a room while he practiced singing. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I got there first. The room was small and had that particular studio quality, that carpeted deadness that recording rooms have, where sound does not travel the way it does in normal rooms. Taylor was there with the engineer. She hugged me. She said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "I wouldn't be anywhere else." She said, "He's been up since 4. I said, "He does that." She said, "I know he does." She smiled a little. "I know he does now." Travis came in about 20 minutes later. He was in a t-shirt and shorts, hair a mess, and he came in the way he comes into rooms he does not want to be in, which is fast, talking, filling the space with noise, so nobody notices he does not want to be there. He said, "Okay, what are we doing? Are we doing this? Let's do this." Taylor said, "Sit down for a minute." He said, "I'm fine." She said, "Sit down for a minute." He sat down. She sat down across from him. She did not say anything for a bit. She just sat there with him. The engineer had discreetly turned his attention to something on a screen, and I had made myself very small in a chair against the wall. After a while she said, "What are you actually afraid of?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "Travis." He said, "I don't know." She waited. And then he said it, in a small voice, in a voice I have not heard from my son since he was very young. He said, "I'm afraid I'm going to open my mouth and it's going to be embarrassing, and everyone is going to be nice about it." Everyone is going to be nice about it. I want to point at that sentence, because that is the whole thing. That is not a fear of failure, that is a fear of a specific kind of failure, the kind where nobody tells you, where the room protects you, where you are handled. Travis Kelce has never been handled in his life. He has been coached, criticized, benched, praised, and challenged, but nobody has ever handled him. He was afraid of being handled. Taylor said, "Okay, then here's what we're going to do." She said, "I am going to tell you the truth. Right now, in this room, in front of your mother. If it's bad, I'm going to say it's bad. And then we're going to fix it or we're going to not do it. Either one is fine. But I am not going to be nice about it." She said, "Do you believe me?" And he looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Yeah." She said, "Okay, stand up." He stood up. He went to the microphone. The engineer did something with a fader. Taylor sat back down in her chair, 10 feet away, and I sat against the wall, and my son closed his eyes. And he sang, "I am going to tell you what happened to me, physically, in that room, because I have never been able to describe it properly to anybody, and I want to try now." I stopped being able to feel the chair. That sounds absurd. I know it sounds absurd. But there was a moment about 8 seconds in when the sound of my son's voice filled that small dead room, and I lost track of the fact that I was sitting in a chair with a floor under me. Because I was 5 years old ago, I was 32 years back. I was in a living room in Euclid, Ohio, with the light going orange through the window and a small, enormous boy on the floor with blocks, singing. The same sound. Bigger, deeper, 30 years of a man's life in it, but the same sound, the same thing that made Ed put down what he was reading and say, "He's got an ear." I put my hand over my mouth. He finished. There was silence in the room. Travis opened his eyes and looked at Taylor, and I saw the entire 15-year-old in his face, waiting, braced, already prepared to be handled. And Taylor Swift said, "Do it exactly like that." He said, "Was it?" She said, "Do it exactly like that." Don't change one thing. Don't add anything. Don't do anything smart with it. Exactly like that. He said, "You're not just—" And she stood up. She said, "Travis, I told you I would tell you the truth. That is the truth. Now say thank you, and stop asking me." And my son laughed, that surprised, wrecked, halfway crying laugh, and said, "Thank you." And she said, "You're welcome." And then she crossed the room and put both hands on his face and said something to him too quiet for me to hear. He nodded. She said, out loud this time, "One more time. Then we go get dinner." He sang it one more time. It was better. Afterward, in the elevator down, Travis was quiet in that way he gets when something has landed. I stood next to him and did not say anything, because I have learned over 36 years that Travis needs about 90 seconds after something important before he can talk about it. At about 90 seconds, he said, "Mom." I said, "Yes." He said, "Was it okay?" And I said the only true thing I had. I said, "Your father heard that in you when you were 5 years old." He turned and looked at me. He said, "He did?" I said, "He put down the newspaper and said, 'That boy has an ear.'" Travis stood in an elevator in Manhattan 2 nights before his wedding and did not say anything at all for the rest of the ride down. But he took my hand. He is 36 years old and 6 feet 5 inches tall, and he took his mother's hand in an elevator and held it until the doors opened. July 3, 2026. I have described that room before, and I will describe it again briefly, because context matters. Madison Square Garden, transformed into something green and white and alive. Trees, real trees, flowers that smelled like flowers. Light that made a building into a cathedral. And in that room, 1,000 people, and among them, the specific 1,000 people that matter for this story: Paul McCartney, Stevie Nicks, producers, label heads, songwriters whose names are on records you own, musicians who have been at the top of their profession for decades and who have spent those decades hearing people sing, professionally, with the practiced ear that separates the real thing from the almost. Half of Nashville. That is what the woman in the kitchen said, and she was not exaggerating by much. The ceremony happened. The vows, 40 minutes of them. Taylor singing part of hers, unaccompanied, in that room, in front of those people, the way only she can do it. Travis crying before the doors even opened, for reasons I have told you about elsewhere. I do. The lift, the kiss, the sign outside lighting up, and then the reception. And somewhere in the middle of that reception, when the room was full and warm and loud, and everyone had eaten, and the dancing had started, and Paul McCartney had already played, somewhere in the middle of all of that, the music stopped. And a microphone was brought out. I was standing near the edge of the room with Ed. I saw Jason move toward the front. I saw Kylie's hand go to her mouth. I saw Andrea Swift turn around from where she had been talking to someone. And I saw my son walk toward that microphone. I want to tell you what he looked like. He looked terrified. Not in the visible way. Not in a way that most people in that room would have noticed. Travis Kelce has spent his entire adult life managing his face in public, and he is extremely good at it. But I am his mother. His hands, that is where it was. His hands were doing the thing they do. Since he was small, since he was a little boy, when Travis is frightened, his hands go slightly open at his sides, fingers spread, like he is bracing to catch something. His hands were open at his sides. He got to the microphone. He looked out at the room. And here is what I saw, and I saw it because I was watching for it, because I had been watching for it since 11 o'clock at night in June. He found Taylor. He looked out into that 1,000-person room, and he found his wife, and he locked onto her the way you lock onto something in a storm. She was standing about 15 feet away, not on a stage, not doing anything, just standing there in her dress in a room full of the most famous musicians in the world, watching her husband about to do something he had not done since he was 15 years old. She did not smile. I want to be specific about that, because I noticed it at the time, and I have thought about it since. She did not give him the encouraging smile. She did not do the thing people do, the little nod, the "you got this" face. She just looked at him, completely still, completely present, with an expression on her face that I can only describe as total attention. She gave him the thing he needed, which was not encouragement. It was witness. I see you. I am not going anywhere. Go. And Travis Kelce opened his mouth and sang. I am not going to tell you what he sang. Some of you may know by now, in the way that things eventually get known. Some of you may not. It does not matter for what I want to say. I am going to tell you what happened in that room instead. The first 4 bars, nobody moved. Not because it was bad, because it was not what they expected. I want you to understand the specific quality of that silence, because I have never experienced anything like it, and I do not expect to again. 1,000 people who thought they knew what was about to happen. The groom does a fun thing. The groom does the bit. Everybody claps. Isn't that charming? 1,000 people had that expectation in their heads. And then a sound came out of my son that was not the bit. I watched it move through the room like a wave, front to back, faces changing, the specific rearrangement that happens on a human face when a prediction fails in an interesting direction. I saw a very famous musician, I am not going to say who, turn his head about 15 degrees and go completely still. That specific stillness. The one professionals have. The one that means, wait, what is this? I saw Stevie Nicks put her hand flat against her chest. I saw a woman who I am fairly certain was one of the 2 from the kitchen the night before, put both hands over her mouth. Jason was at the front, near the microphone, and Jason's face did what Jason's face does when he is overwhelmed and trying not to be, which is nothing at all for about 4 seconds and then everything at once. Kylie was crying. Andrea Swift had her hand on Scott's arm. And Taylor. Taylor did not move. Through all of it. She stood in that exact spot 15 feet away with that same expression of total attention, and she did not move an inch, and she did not look away from him once. And Travis sang to her. Only to her. Exactly the way I had told him on the phone in June. Everyone else was furniture. He sang to his wife in a room containing some of the greatest musicians who have ever lived, and none of them existed for him. His voice was not perfect. I want to say that honestly, because I am not going to sit here and tell you my son sang like a professional recording artist, because he did not, because he has not spent 20 years doing what those people in that room have spent 20 years doing. But it was real. And you cannot fake real, and there is not a single person in a room full of professional musicians who cannot tell the difference in about 2 seconds. It was real, and it was his, and it came out of somewhere that had been closed for 21 years. When he finished, there was a moment, maybe half a second, maybe less, of nothing. And then that room came apart. I have been in stadiums. I have heard 80,000 people make noise about something my son did on a football field. I have heard the specific roar of a Super Bowl. This was not louder. Madison Square Garden with 1,000 people in it cannot be louder than Arrowhead. But it was something else. It was something that had a different quality entirely. It was the sound of a room full of people who understand exactly how hard it is to do that, applauding someone who had just done it in front of them for the first time in his life. Ed was gripping my hand, and I did not know when he had taken it. I was crying, and I did not know when that had started either. I want to tell you about 4 little girls. Wyatt was 6 years old that night. Elliot was 5. Bennett was 4. Finley was 4 months and was not in the room, and I have made my peace with that, and she will hear about it her whole life. The 3 older ones were in the room. Kylie had them together near the side, because Kylie is a woman with a system, because you do not have 4 daughters under 7 without developing a system. They had been dancing. They had been at the arcade games. Elliot had been asleep and had woken up. It was late for all of them, and they were in that overtired state where children become either very difficult or very strange, and these 3 had gone strange, which in my experience is the better outcome. When the microphone came out, Wyatt stopped moving. I saw it happen because I was looking in that direction. Wyatt Kelce, 6 years old, in a white dress she had been spinning in for 6 hours, went completely still when her uncle walked toward that microphone. She did not know what was happening. She could not have. She had no context for it, no idea that this was a thing he had not done since he was 15, no framework for why a room full of adults had gone quiet. But children know when something is happening. They are better at it than we are. They read a room in half a second because they have not yet learned to talk themselves out of what they perceive. Wyatt knew something was happening. She reached up and took Kylie's hand without looking. And when Travis started singing, Wyatt's mouth opened. I saw it. I was maybe 20 feet from them, and I saw a 6-year-old girl's mouth fall open in an expression of pure, uncomplicated astonishment. Elliot, 5 years old, turned around to look at her mother, checking, the way small children check, the way they look at an adult's face to figure out what they are supposed to feel about a thing they do not understand. And she found Kylie crying. And Elliot's face did something complicated. Bennett, who is 4, and who had spent the evening in a backwards jersey pursuing her own agenda, simply sat down on the floor. She sat down on the floor of Madison Square Garden in the middle of her uncle's wedding reception and put her chin in her hands and listened. Nobody told her to. Nobody moved her. She sat on the floor in a green and white room in front of 1,000 people and listened to Travis Kelce sing. Afterward, after the room came apart, after Travis had gone to Taylor, after Jason had grabbed him by the shoulders, Wyatt let go of Kylie's hand and made her way through legs and chairs toward the front. She got to Travis. She pulled on his sleeve until he looked down. And she said, and I got this from Kylie, who was 3 feet away, who heard it clearly, and who has repeated it to me maybe 6 times since because she cannot get over it. Wyatt said, Uncle Trav, do you know how to do that? And Travis, still wrecked, still catching his breath, laughed and picked her up. And he said, I didn't know. I found out tonight. And Wyatt said, You found out tonight? And Travis said, Yeah, bug, tonight. And Wyatt thought about it for a second, the way 6-year-olds think about things, with visible effort. And then she said, Can you find out more stuff? Travis Kelce stood in Madison Square Garden holding his 6-year-old niece who had just asked him whether he could find out more stuff about himself. And Kylie says he did not answer for a second. And then he said, I'm gonna try. And Travis put the microphone down. He walked directly to Taylor, through the noise, through the people, straight to her, and he put his arms around her, and put his face into her shoulder, and stayed there. She held on to him, and I watched, from 30 feet away, through a room that was still applauding, still on its feet. I watched my daughter-in-law hold my son while he came apart, in a way I have only seen a handful of times in his entire life. I do not know what she said to him. Her mouth was moving. She was saying something into the side of his head. I will never know what it was. But I know what it did, because after about 10 seconds he pulled back and looked at her and laughed. That laugh, the enormous one, the one that has been the same since he was 4 years old, and wiped his face with the back of his hand, and said something back to her that made her laugh too. And then Jason arrived and grabbed him by both shoulders and shook him, hard, the way brothers do, and said something loudly that I could not hear over the noise, but which I later learned was, I told you. I told you. I have been telling people for 30 years. Which is true. Jason has been telling people for 30 years. Jason said publicly, months earlier, that Travis can sing and has always been able to carry a tune, and nobody paid any attention because it sounded like an older brother being nice. It was not an older brother being nice. It was an older brother telling the truth and nobody listening. I have to tell you about Ed. Because I have talked about Ed heard it first, Ed put down the paper, Ed said he's got an ear. And then Ed disappeared from this story for 32 years, which is not fair to him, and I want to correct it. Ed Kelce was standing next to me when Travis sang. I told you he was gripping my hand, and I did not know when he had taken it. That is true. But I did not tell you what happened when it was over. When the room came apart, when 1,000 people came up out of their seats, Ed did not move. Everybody around us was standing and shouting and clapping, and Ed Kelce stood completely still with my hand in his and looked at the front of the room where his son was standing. And he said, to nobody, in a voice I could barely hear over the noise. He said, I told you. I said, what? He said, louder, I told you. In the living room, 1994. And I started laughing and crying at the same time in the middle of Madison Square Garden. He said, I said that boy had an ear, and you said he's 5. I said, I remember. He said, he's not 5 now. I said, no, he's not. Ed Kelce is not a man who says, I told you so. In 50-plus years, he has had 1,000 opportunities and taken maybe 4 of them. He is a man who lets things be right without having to be seen being right about them. But he took that one. He earned that one. Later, much later, near the end of the night, when things had gotten quiet in the corners of that room and people were beginning to drift, I saw Ed and Travis standing together near the arcade games. They were not talking, just standing. And then Ed reached up and put his hand on the back of Travis's neck. That gesture, the one fathers do to sons, the one Ed has done to both those boys since they were small enough to have to bend down for. He said something. Travis nodded. That was the whole exchange. 2 men, 1 hand on a neck, 1 sentence, 1 nod. I asked Travis about it weeks later. What did your father say to you? Travis said. He said, that's what I heard. I said, that's it? Travis said, that's it. And then he said, Mom, do you know how long I've wanted my dad to say something like that to me, about something that wasn't football? And I said, no. How long? And he said, my whole life. Later that night, I found the woman from the kitchen. Not on purpose. I was not hunting her down. I want to be very clear that I did not go looking for her, because I am not a person who does that. But I ended up standing near her at one point, and she turned and saw me, and she said, Donna. And I said, hi. And she said, and I am going to try to reproduce this accurately, because it mattered. She said, I owe you an apology, and I owe him one more. I said, for what? She said, I said something last night, about him singing. I said I hoped somebody had told him what he was walking into. She looked at me. She said, you heard me, didn't you? I said, yes. She closed her eyes for a second. She said, I'm so sorry. And I said what I actually felt, which was, don't be. She looked surprised. I said, you were worried about him because you love her. That's not something to apologize for. That's the correct instinct. You've been protecting that girl for a long time, and you weren't going to stop just because she got married. She was quiet. I said, and you were also wrong. And she laughed, a real slightly wrecked laugh, and said, I was so wrong. I said, it's all right. Everybody was. She said, not everybody. She wasn't. And I said, no, she wasn't. We stood there together for a moment, looking out at the room, at the dancing, at the arcade games in the back that Travis had insisted on, at Wyatt spinning in her white dress, at Elliot asleep in a chair still holding a bouquet, at Bennett located somewhere in a backwards jersey with an unidentified food item, at my son, across the room, with his arm around his wife, talking to Paul McCartney. Let me say that again. At my son, in a room he had been afraid to sing in, talking to Paul McCartney afterward. I do not know what they talked about. Travis has never told me, and I have never asked, because some things belong to the person they happen to, and my son has earned the right to keep a few. But I watched his face while he was talking, and his face was the face of the 5-year-old in the living room in Euclid, Ohio, who sang about the mailman and did not know yet that anyone could laugh. There is an aftermath to that night that I want to describe, because it is the part that nobody outside a very small circle knows. In the 3 weeks after the wedding, Travis got phone calls. Not from journalists. Not from anybody looking for a story, from musicians. I know about 4 of them because he told me about 4 of them. There may have been more. There probably were more, because Travis does not report every good thing that happens to him. He tends to sit on them for a while, like they might not be real. The first one came 2 days after the wedding. Travis was in Missouri, at camp. Someone whose name you would recognize instantly called his phone. The conversation, as Travis reported it to me, was about 90 seconds long. The man said, "I was in the room." Travis said, "Yeah." The man said, "I want you to know that I have been doing this for a long time, and I do not call people." Travis said, "Okay." The man said, "If you ever want to sit in a room and work on something, my number is now in your phone." And then he hung up. That was it. 90 seconds. No pitch, no arrangement, no let's have our people talk. A man who has spent his life around singers heard something and made a phone call and then got off the phone because he had said what he called to say. The second one was a woman. She wrote instead of calling. Travis read me part of what she wrote, and I am not going to reproduce it because it was hers and it was private. But the essence of it was, do not let anybody talk you into making this slick. Whatever you do with this, keep it rough. The roughness is what it is. The third one was somebody from Nashville proper, a songwriter. That call was longer. Travis said it was over an hour, and it was mostly the songwriter asking questions. What do you listen to? Who do you love? What was the first record that ever meant something to you? Do you write anything down? Travis said, I've written things down my whole life. Not songs, just things. The songwriter said, bring them. The fourth call was the one that got him. It was Jason. Jason called him about a week after the wedding and said, I need to tell you something and I need you to shut up while I say it. Travis said okay. Jason said, I have been telling people for 30 years that you can sing. And every time I said it, people smiled at me like I was being a nice brother. Every single time. For 30 years. Jason said, and I want you to know that I never said it to be nice. Not once. I said it because it's true, and it's been true since we shared a room, and you used to sing to yourself at night when you thought I was asleep. There was a silence on that phone call, Travis said. A long one. Then Jason said, you did that until you were 15, and then you stopped, and I noticed, and I never said anything about it, because I was 17, and I was an idiot. And Travis said, Jace. And Jason said, I noticed. I want you to know somebody noticed. Travis told me about that call, and his voice was doing the thing. He said, he noticed, Mom. I said, of course he noticed. He's your brother. He said, he never said anything. I said, he was 17. He said, yeah. He said, I know. And then he said, I'm going to call him back. I've got to call him back. And he hung up on me to call his brother, which is the correct priority, and I have never been prouder of a hang-up in my life. I want to say something about doubt, because doubt is going to keep coming. It has already started. There are people in the music industry, people who know that world far better than I ever will, who have said that Travis is underestimating how hard country music is. That celebrity opens a door but does not keep you on a chart. That Nashville has to respect you, and respect is not something a famous name can purchase. Here is my honest opinion about all of that. They are right. Nashville is hard. It should be hard. It is a town built by people who worked at a craft for years in rooms nobody was watching, and the respect they give is earned rather than granted. And that is exactly how it should be. If it were easy, it would not be worth anything. Travis has not earned that yet. He knows it. He has said as much. Anybody who thinks a wedding performance makes you a country artist does not understand what a country artist is. So the doubters are correct about the difficulty. They are wrong about the man. I have watched Travis Kelce work for 36 years. I watched him go from an undersized kid to a college quarterback to a tight end to one of the most productive players in the history of his position. I watched him fail and rebuild. I watched him get in trouble at Cincinnati and get thrown off the team and work his way back and become a captain. I watched him at 23, 28, 34, 36, put in hours in facilities that nobody was watching, on days when nobody would have known if he had skipped. He has never once, in my presence, taken a shortcut. He does not know how. So when someone tells me that Travis Kelce might underestimate how hard something is, I understand what they mean, and I do not entirely disagree with the caution. But I also know something they do not know. I know that when he was 5 years old in a living room in Euclid, Ohio, his father heard something in his voice. I know that when he was 15, somebody laughed, and he closed a door and did not open it for 21 years. I know that in June 2026 he called me at 11 o'clock at night with his voice shaking and told me that a woman who has spent her entire life around the greatest singers on earth had told him he had something. And I know that on July 3, 2026, in a room containing Paul McCartney and Stevie Nicks and half the music industry, he opened his mouth and proved her right. Whatever comes after that is a long road. Nobody in my family thinks otherwise. But the door is open. The door that closed at 15 years old in a high school choir room in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, is open. And the person who opened it was Taylor Swift, who did not do it with encouragement or praise or a pep talk, but by doing the only thing that has ever actually worked on Travis Kelce. She told him the truth, and then she stood 15 feet away and did not look away. There is one more thing. About 2 weeks after the wedding, I was on the phone with Travis. He was at training camp in Missouri, tired, in the good way, working through the ordinary business of a season starting. At some point he said, "Hey, can I tell you something weird?" I said, "Always." He said, "I've been singing." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, like, in the car, in the shower, around the house. I've just been singing, all the time. And I noticed it a few days ago, and I thought, when did that start? He paused. He said, and then I realized. It started that night. I did not say anything. He said, it's like something got unlocked. It's like there was a thing I was not letting myself do, and I didn't even know I wasn't letting myself do it until I did it. He said, does that make sense? And I said, Travis, you did that constantly until you were 15. Silence on the line. He said, I did? I said, constantly. In the car, in the bathtub, at the table. You had a song about the dog. You had a song about the mailman. Longer silence. He said, quietly, I forgot that. I said, I know. He said, I completely forgot that. I said, I didn't. And my son, 36 years old, married 3 weeks, in a hotel room in Missouri, after a day of practice in July heat, said, Mom. And I said, yes. And he said, thank you for remembering. There is one conversation left that I need to give you, and it is the one that made me want to tell this whole story in the first place. It was late July, about 3 weeks after the wedding. Taylor called me on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason at all, which is a thing she does now, which is one of the great unexpected pleasures of my 70s. We talked about ordinary things, Travis at camp, the heat in Missouri, something one of Jason's girls had said. And then I said, "Can I ask you something I've been wanting to ask?" She said, "Always." I said, "That night in the studio, the rehearsal, when you told him you'd tell him the truth even if it was bad." She said, "Yes." I said, "What if it had been bad?" There was a pause. She said, "Then I would have told him it was bad." I said, "Would you really?" And she said something that I want every person listening to this to hear, because I think it is the most important thing anybody has said in this entire story. She said, "Donna, if I had lied to him in that room, he would have found out. Maybe not that night, maybe not for a year, but he would have found out, because the world tells you eventually." She said, "And the day he found out, he would have learned that I am a person who protects him from the truth." She said, "And then every single thing I ever say to him for the rest of our lives would have an asterisk on it." She said, "I would rather have told him it was bad and had him hate me for a week than have him wonder for 50 years whether I actually mean the things I say." I sat with the phone against my ear. She said, "I've been on the receiving end of people being nice to me instead of honest with me my whole career, and it's—" She stopped, looking for it. "It's the loneliest thing in the world. You end up not being able to trust anything anyone says. And then you're alone in a room full of people who love you." She said, "I'm not doing that to him. Not ever. Not about anything." I said, "Taylor." She said, "Yes?" I said, "Do you know what you've just described?" She said, "What?" I said, "You've just described a marriage. That's a marriage. That's the whole thing right there." She laughed. A little. She said, "I hope so." I said, "I've been in one for a very long time. I know what one looks like. That's what one looks like." Then she said something else. She said, "Can I tell you the real reason I asked him to sing at the wedding?" I said, "I thought you told me the real reason." She said, "I told you part of it." I waited. She said, "The whole thing about how I could hear something in his voice, that's all true, but that's not why I asked." She said, "I asked because I wanted 1,000 people to watch him do something he was afraid of." She said, "Not for them, for him. I wanted him to have a memory of himself being afraid, and doing it anyway in front of everyone he loves. Because I think he has 100 memories like that from football, and 0 memories like that from anything else, and I think that has made him believe that he is only brave inside a helmet." She said, "He is the bravest person I know, and he thinks it only counts on a field." She said, "I wanted to give him one that had nothing to do with football, one he could keep." I did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, "Does he know that's why you asked?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Are you going to tell him?" And she said, "Someday, when he needs it." I have thought about that answer maybe 200 times since. She is holding it. She has a thing she could give him that would mean the world, and she is holding it, deliberately, until a day when he will need it more than he needs it now. That is not romance. That is not sweetness. That is strategy in the service of love, which is the rarest and most valuable thing two people can build, and which almost nobody manages before about year 30. She has it at 3 years. I do not know what my son did to deserve her. But I know he asked me that exact question in a kitchen in Leawood, Kansas, in November of 2025, and now I have watched them both spend a year answering it. 50 years from now, somebody in this family is going to hear a recording. I do not know what recording. I do not know whether Travis makes an album or does not make an album, whether Nashville comes around or does not come around, whether the doubters end up being right about the difficulty in the ways they predicted. That part is not up to me, and it is not up to Taylor, and honestly, it is only partly up to Travis, because that is how the world works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But there will be a recording, somewhere, of some kind. Something from that night or after it. Something exists now that did not exist before July 3rd, 2026. And 50 years from now, a young person in this family is going to hear it. Maybe it will be one of Jason's girls playing it for her own children. Maybe it will be Finley, who was 4 months old that night, who was somewhere in the building being cared for, who understood nothing at all, playing it for a grandchild of her own and saying, "That's your great-uncle Travis. That's the first time he ever really sang in front of anybody." And that child is going to say, "What do you mean the first time? He was old." And whoever is telling it will say, "He stopped when he was 15 because somebody laughed, and he didn't start again for 21 years. And then he married a woman who heard him through a wall one night when he didn't know she was awake, and she told him the truth, and he believed her." And the child will say, "That's it? That's all it took?" And the answer is yes, that is all it took. One person who heard him. That is all it has ever taken, for anybody, in any part of life. Not a crowd, not an industry, not a chart or a review, or the approval of a room full of professionals. One person who hears you and tells you the truth about what they heard. Taylor Swift did that for my son. They said he would never sing. She told me something different, in private, on a phone call in June, quietly, without any drama, the way you say things that you simply know to be true. She said, "He has something in his voice." She was right. She has been right about him from the beginning. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. And on July 3rd, 2026, in a room full of people who make music for a living, my son sang out loud for the first time since he was 15 years old. Nobody laughed. Thank you for sitting with me today.